There is a map that shouldn't exist, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. It depicts, with a precision that defies all rational explanation, the coastline of a continent that wasn't officially discovered until 1820. That alone would be enough to make one pause and wonder. But there is something else that makes this map unsettling on a completely different level. What it depicts is not Antarctica as we know it today, covered by 3 kilometers of ice. What it depicts is Antarctica as no one in the 16th century could have seen it, with its coastlines exposed, with its mountains exposed, with its rivers, with a geography that, according to 20th century seismic measurements, corresponds exactly to the ground lying beneath the ice, invisible for millennia. And the question that map has been asking silently for 5 centuries is the question we are going to explore in depth today. Who was there? To understand what we are going to explore in this story, we must begin with something that official history accepts without question, and yet opens a vast door to the unknown. Antarctica was not always where it is. The continent we know today as the planet's largest ice mass, that 4 million square kilometer territory surrounding the South Pole with a white blanket 2 to 4 kilometers thick, was not always like this. There was a time, thousands of years ago, when that continent was in a different geographical position. It had sandy shores, rivers that flowed toward the sea, mountain ranges bathed in sunlight that still managed to reach them, forests, according to geological records, life, a temperature that, though not tropical, was entirely habitable. This is not speculation. It is geology. Ice cores extracted by scientific teams from multiple nations in the 20th century confirm that Antarctica experienced a period of radically different climate in a past that is not as remote as our mental comfort would have us believe. And when geology says that, when sedimentary records and fossilized pollen found beneath the ice show evidence of vegetation, of liquid water, of conditions compatible with life, the question that arises is not scientific. It is human. What was there? Imagine for a moment that you can see that continent just as it was at the height of its accessibility, not today's white desert, not the land of 300-kilometer-per-hour winds and 6-month polar nights, but the earlier version, the version no one taught you in school, not because it didn't exist, but because what existed there challenges, in uncomfortable ways, the timeline we've constructed to understand human civilization. You see a coastline, a real coastline with dark gray stone beaches and cliffs that the wind has shaped over centuries. The waters surrounding the continent are not the gray, menacing waters of the Antarctic Ocean we know, but something colder than the Mediterranean, yet perfectly navigable during the southern summer months when sunlight falls obliquely and long across the surface of the world. Behind that coastline, the terrain rises in terraces toward the interior, and on those terraces, there is something for which geologists have found evidence, something that the conventional narrative is slow to process. Civilization, or at least organized human presence, is the hypothesis that a growing number of independent researchers have begun to propose in recent decades, not as a certainty, as a question that the data make inevitable. Return to the Piri Reis map. The Ottoman admiral was neither a visionary nor a prophet. He was a professional cartographer who worked from source maps, from earlier documents that he consulted and compiled. And in the note he himself wrote in the margin of that extraordinary map, in an annotation that 20th century translators recovered from Old Turkish, Piri Reis says something that takes your breath away. He says that some of his source maps were contemporary to his own time, but others, he says, were of an antiquity that he himself could not determine with certainty. Maps of indeterminate age, depicting a continent unknown to 16th century European navigators, with an accuracy that 20th century satellites confirmed on the ground beneath the ice. The official explanation for this is a combination of coincidence and misinterpretation. That the similarity between what Piri Reis drew and the actual subglacial topography is approximate, not exact, that the margins of error are large enough for the correspondence to be accidental. But there is something that explanation cannot easily resolve. Piri Reis's map is not the only one. The Franco-Portuguese cartographer Diego Ribeiro, working in 1529, drew on one of his maps a continental landmass in the south that does not correspond to any known land in that position at the time. The map by Orontius Phineus from 1531 shows an Antarctic continent with interior mountain ranges with bays that penetrate inland, with a drainage network that corresponds once again to what actual subglacial geography reveals beneath the ice when seismic waves illuminate it from above. How does conventional history explain that 16th century cartographers depicted in functional detail a continent that no one officially discovered until 3 centuries later? The explanations are varied. None is entirely satisfactory. And in that space between the question and the unsatisfactory answer, in that uncomfortable territory where real data does not fit well into established categories, is where the most honest imagination must pause and consider what the maps are saying. Someone was there before. To understand what that would imply, we need to reconstruct, with all the freedom that creative fiction allows, what that before might have been. Geological dating suggests that Antarctica began its most intense glaciation, the one that produced the ice sheet we know today, approximately 12,000 years ago. This coincides within the margins of scientific uncertainty that are inevitable in that time frame with the end of the Pleistocene, with the end of the last ice age in the northern hemisphere, and with a period of geological and climatic changes occurring at a speed that, viewed from a human scale, must have seemed catastrophic. 12,000 years ago. At that temporal threshold, the orthodox narrative places humanity at the dawn of the Neolithic Revolution, in the first villages, in the first experiments with agriculture, in the first attempts to domesticate animals, a technologically simple humanity scattered, without writing, without long-range ocean navigation. But that narrative has cracks, and the cracks are not small. Göbekli Tepe, in present-day Turkey, was built over 11,000 years ago with an architectural complexity and symbolic sophistication that openly contradicts the image of early Neolithic humans as barely organized hunter-gatherers. Its stone columns up to 6 meters high, its animal bas reliefs, the scale of its construction, all require a level of social and technical organization that is supposed not to have existed in that period. If such a thing existed in Anatolia 11,000 years ago, what might have been happening at the same time on a continent that was then accessible, perhaps inhabited for millennia prior, with navigable coasts and natural resources? The question becomes harder to ignore. Imagine the city that might have existed on the Antarctic coast. Don't project it onto the standards of Babylon or Egypt, which are much later civilizations. Imagine it on its own terms. A coastal civilization, likely maritime, organized around the resources of the ocean and the inland lowlands. Its structures, if there were any, would be made of stone, because stone is what endures, what remains, what can eventually survive under 3 kilometers of ice, as structures that modern seismic surveys record without being able to fully classify. There have been scientific expeditions. There have been ground-penetrating radar images showing geometric anomalies beneath the Antarctic ice, structures that are perfectly consistent with natural geological formations, and that are also perfectly consistent with something else. That is the problem. The ambiguity the data allows. The impossibility of knowing for certain without an excavation, which logistics, cost, and something more than just logistics and cost have prevented so far. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959 by 12 nations and subsequently expanded, establishes that Antarctica is a demilitarized territory open to free scientific research, preserved for humanity. It is an extraordinary treaty in its intentions, and it has a clause that is not in the official text, but operates with the force of an unwritten law. Access to the continent's deep interior is de facto limited to projects that have institutional backing, logistical resources, and authorization from the signatory states. Independent expeditions seeking to approach specific areas of the continent, certain anomalies beneath the ice that radar maps have recorded, encounter obstacles that go beyond mere logistics. Does this prove there is something to hide? No, but there is something that modern history has repeatedly demonstrated, and that is worth stating clearly. Governments and institutions do not actively suppress every disturbing discovery. What they do, more frequently and more effectively, is simply not fund the questions that make them uncomfortable. Do not publish data that cannot be explained. Do not open up institutional space for anomalies to be investigated with the same seriousness with which things that already fit into the established framework are investigated. The most effective suppression does not require censorship. It requires institutionalized indifference. In 2018, a team of scientists from the University of Kent published an analysis of satellite images of Antarctica that identified more than 100 square kilometers of structures on the continent that they described as pyramid-like in their morphology. The scientific community's response was swift and uniform. Natural pyramid-shaped formations produced by glacial erosion, called nunataks, are well known in polar geology. There is nothing extraordinary about geometric shapes produced by natural forces. It is a correct explanation. And it is also, if one sits with it long enough, an explanation that does not fully answer the question, because glacial geology produces pyramid-shaped formations with a frequency and under specific conditions that glaciologists know well. And some of the structures identified in those satellite images exhibit proportions and orientations that the glaciologists consulted themselves described as unusual, before framing it all within the reassuring category of the natural. Unusual. In scientific vocabulary, unusual is sometimes the most honest word, and also the one most easily dismissed. There is something else in this story that cannot be ignored, and that fiction has the freedom to explore with the seriousness the subject deserves. In 1947, U.S. Admiral Richard Byrd led Operation High Jump, a military expedition to Antarctica on a scale that has never been repeated. 13 ships, an aircraft carrier, more than 4,000 soldiers for a scientific expedition. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, when military resources were scarce and priorities were many. The official justification was training in extreme conditions and Antarctic scientific research. The expedition lasted considerably less than planned. Byrd returned early, and in the interview he gave to Chilean journalist Lee Van Atta for the publication El Mercurio in 1947, the admiral made a statement that has been alternately cited, interpreted, questioned, and shelved for decades. He spoke of the need for the United States to prepare for the possibility of an attack originating from the poles. He spoke of a threat that could reach American cities traveling at speeds that the aviation of the time could not match. What did Byrd find in Antarctica? The official answer is that he found nothing he did not expect to find, that the expedition fulfilled its objectives and returned, that Byrd's statement was a comment on the geopolitical vulnerability of the poles in the emerging Cold War. The answer that fiction can explore is different. Imagine that deep within the Antarctic ice, preserved by the very cold that buried it, there exists a record, not of a technologically advanced civilization in the cinematic sense, not of machines or exotic energies, but of a civilization that sailed the world's oceans in a period predating all records we have of human navigation. A civilization that mapped the continents, that observed the stars with a precision that allowed it to cross oceans, that built in stone and knew geometry well enough to leave marks on the landscape that time and ice have not been able to erase entirely, and that at some point, approximately 12,000 years ago, it was overtaken by something. Accelerated climate change, a geological cataclysm, an astronomical event that caused ice to advance rapidly across the southern continent, and that this civilization, or its survivors, migrated. They took their knowledge with them, their maps, their understanding of the world, and that knowledge filtered through in fragments from culture to culture, from generation to generation, until it reached the hands of a 16th century Ottoman admiral who incorporated it into his map without fully understanding where it came from. The Piri Reis map is not an inexplicable anomaly. It is an echo, the last fragment of a knowledge that almost disappeared. Why is this unsettling? Not because it is necessarily true, but because it is possible. Because the data that exists, Piri Reis's map, the anomalies beneath the Antarctic ice, the unexplained brevity of Operation High Jump, the existence of Göbekli Tepe and other contemporary sites that contradict the established chronology of human civilization, all of that data is real. What we do with them, the weight we assign to them, the connections we build or refuse to build between them, that is where interpretation comes in. And interpretation is not neutral. It never is. What the conventional narrative calls rigorous thinking is often simply the systematic rejection of questions that threaten the coherence of the established model. And what the explorers of these ideas call suppressed discovery is sometimes simply the overinterpretation of coincidences. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between those two attitudes. But if you had to choose, if you had to decide whether the world that existed before the Antarctic ice was simply empty, or whether it was something more, something that our historical categories still lack the capacity to fully encompass, what would your most honest intuition choose? There is one image I want you to take away from this story. In 2009, the ice-penetrating radar system of the BEDMAP-2 project completed the most detailed map ever produced of the Antarctic surface, mountains exceeding 4,000 meters in height, valleys that, in a world without ice, would be deep, accessible fjords, subglacial lakes the size of inland seas with liquid water that has remained in contact with the atmosphere for millions of years. And on those maps, distributed across areas corresponding to coastlines that would have been habitable before glaciation, geometric anomalies that the project's scientists classified as likely geological in origin. Probable. Not certain. Probable. Beneath 3 kilometers of ice, the continent that an Ottoman admiral sketched in 1513 still exists, intact and frozen, waiting for the technology or institutional will that one day decides to truly look at it. Not with the budget of a geological characterization project, but with the honest question of what was there before. That day has not yet come. But the maps exist, the anomalies exist, the questions exist, and the questions that no one dares to finish asking are often the ones that hold the most important answers. Before closing, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it from the most honest place within yourself. When was the last time a question seemed too big for the framework you had available? When did you come across a piece of data, a coincidence, an anomaly in the official history that gave you that specific unease of something not quite fitting? Tell me about it in the comments. Not the discoveries you have confirmed, the ones that give you that strange feeling that the world we know might be older, more complex, and more mysterious than we were taught. Because if there's one thing Antarctica tells us from beneath its ice, with its maps that shouldn't exist and its anomalies that no one ever fully investigates, it's that human history has chapters we haven't yet learned to read. Subscribe to the channel if these kinds of questions keep you up at night the way they keep us up. Every week we continue to explore together the edges of the known map, the places where the map ends and the questions begin, because those edges are always where the most interesting stories wait to be told. And share this video with someone who needs to remember that the world is bigger, older, and stranger than any textbook has ever been able to contain. The ice holds its secrets, but the ice also melts.